Tolkien's universe and the Goblins in Rowling's universe have a lot of Jewish attributes, and so we'll sort of discuss them and how they relate to Judaism and whether or not these are philo-Semitic, anti-Semitic, a reasonable portrayal of Jews, an unreasonable portrayal of Jews, and the way we're going to do it is that we'll go through the history and situations that both of these ethnicities find themselves in their respective universes, and compare those with the Jewish story, which many of us know to a reasonable degree. All right. So, so I'm calling them allegorical Jews. So in the case of the dwarves, Tolkien had an interview in 1964, I want to say, as he was older, and he admitted that there were some things that he thought were Jewish about the dwarves. The ones that he sort of centralized on were was the language, the dwarvish language, the relationship between the dwarves to other states, the dwarves' warlike ability, and the fact that the dwarves had to move over numerous times in their history. So we're going to see some of that. We're going to see some other things that also may be connected with sort of a view of what Jews are. So to start with, this is the best map I could find of the whole of Middle Earth. This map may look kind of strange to some of you because you're probably used to something that looks more like this. In truth, the western lands of Beleriand fell under the water in the end of the War of Wrath. We're going to discuss that at the end of the first stage. And so the map that you're probably used to looks something more like this, because that's what it looked like in the Third Age when the Lord of the Rings events happened. And so that's the map that people are more familiar with. But if we go back to this map, we can see that the world is divided into sort of three major chunks by the mountains, right? You have that westernmost area called Beleriand, you have that central land called Eriador, and to the east you have Ravania. So if we see the mountains sort of cutting up these sort of cubes of territory, we have those three regions. In the cosmology of Middle Earth, where Tolkien tends to focus is on the westernmost area. So during the First Age, he focuses on Beleriand. During the Second and Third Ages, he tends to focus on Eriador, and then increasingly on Ravania. You can see that Rohan and Gondor, right? Those are the main countries that are discussed in the Two Towers and Return of the King, respectively, and those are in sort of the edge of that Ravanian territory, right? There's the slow slide towards the east, as compared to, right, our heroes Frodo and Sam, the hobbits. They live in the Shire, which is in the center of Eriador. Is everybody sort of with me so far on the geography?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, if we talk about the births of the dwarves, Tolkien asserts that there are 7 dwarvish clans, and these clans all are born in the mountains. So if we move from east to west, you have 4 clans of the dwarves that are born in the Orokarni, in the northeast of the world. Now, the Orokarni, or the Red Mountains, are beyond the country of Rhûn. Rhûn is the country of the Easterlings, if you remember from Lord of the Rings, right? Those are the ones with the very stylish helmets that Frodo and Sam see in front of the Black Gate. The Easterlings come from this country of Rhûn, and they are the largest population of men. But these dwarves come from over that territory, on the far side of that territory. So we don't really see them or hear about them. We hear about them sometimes in passing, but these 4 clans of the dwarves are really not discussed in any real detail. The dwarves that we know from Lord of the Rings, we're talking about Gimli, the dwarves of the Hobbit, like Thorin Oakenshield, and most of the dwarven characters we're familiar with are from the Longbeard group, which live in the Misty Mountains, right? At the northern top of that circle, you have Mount Gundabad, which was the original waking place of the Longbeards. But of course, they live throughout the entire chain, especially the country of Moria. We'll go more in depth with that, of course. Um, Eventually, they move into the Grey Mountains, which are to the north and east of Mount Gundabad. And of course, if we remember the story of Thorin Oakenshield, his entire quest is to go to Erebor, which is the Lonely Mountain, just southeast of the Grey Mountains, and to the east itself of the Iron Hills. Um, as we move further west, we have two more dwarven clans with Broadgreens and Firebeards, which are in the Blue Mountains. And then further west, in the city of Nargothrond, we have the Petty Dwarves. And the Petty Dwarves are a group of dwarves who have been exiled from all 7 of the clans. They weren't considered traditional enough, and so they made their way further west. Now, as I said, since Tolkien begins his story moving from the westernmost land to the easternmost land, the Petty Dwarves are the dwarves that we really see in the beginning of the story. So now, now I want to take you back to the creation of the universe. So Tolkien has a very clear system of divinities and lower beings. So at the top, he has Eru Iluvatar. We can sort of imagine Eru Iluvatar. You can see his image on the left-hand side as God. Below him are what are called the Valar. The Valar are these sort of angelic beings. Eru Iluvatar has possession of what is called the secret fire. This is the ability to give life forms true independent thought and motion. None of the Valar possess this. The Valar, though, do have amazing creative abilities, and one of those Valar is called Aule. So Eru Iluvatar discusses his vision, and in his vision, he is going to create a world with 2 dominant species, the firstborn being the elves, and the secondborn being the men. But he waits some time to waken them from their sleep. In this time, Aule decides to create his own beings, and not knowing the true designs of Eru Iluvatar, he makes them stunted and deformed. And so they are the dwarves. You can see in the middle frame Aule composing the dwarves out of stone and bringing them to life. Of course, since Aule is Valar, he doesn't have the secret fire, and the dwarves only have consciousness when he pours his soul into them. The moment he turns away from them, they turn back into stone. Eru Iluvatar discovers this, and he confronts Aule that he has created these beings and orders Aule to destroy them. So you can see in the upper right-hand corner, Aule being commanded to destroy the dwarves, takes out his smithing iron in order to do that. But you can see the dwarves themselves begin to have their own reaction because Iluvatar decided to invest them with the secret fire and give them life. And Aule is allowed to take down his.
Seth, I'll have some.
What? Okay, and is allowed to.
No, she, yeah.
Sorry.
She was just, I guess, talking to somebody else.
Okay. He's allowed to put down his hammer and allow the dwarves to live. However, since the elves had not been woken, and Eru Iluvatar had decreed that the elves would be the firstborn, the dwarves were put back to sleep and would only be awoken once the elves had reached Middle-earth. So there are a couple things that are sort of interesting about this story, right? The first one is that the dwarves already have a unique creation story relative to the main species, right? The elves and men are supposed to be the dominant species of Middle-earth. They're the ones of God's true creation. And the dwarves are somehow lesser than these two. That Eru Iluvatar decides to adopt them into his universe, but they somehow have a lesser or relegated lower position in the universe. And they were not created by God himself, but by one of the angels. Right? You have the second sort of unique thing here is that the dwarves, despite awakening before the elves, have to be brought down and reawoken later, so that the elves can wake first. You can read this almost as supersessionism, right? That the dwarves were there first, that their culture was the preeminent culture. However, the elves that replaced them had to take on the mantle of being the preeminent culture. And so the dwarves were forced to go back to sleep and only resurrected later in the place of the elves, the same way that you could say in our universe, Jews had to give way to Christianity, right? That the elves representing the sort of European culture replaced these sort of stunted, more stunted, shorter Jews, right? But you could also see it as a connection to the original Dwarvish creations in the Edda, the Norse epics, where the dwarves leap into existence as maggots from the workshop of the smithing gods, right? You could see it as a retelling of that story as well. So it has this sort of duality that it can be interpreted through a Jewish lens. I don't think Tolkien originally meant for it to be interpreted through a Jewish lens, but it can be interpreted through a Jewish lens, or it can be interpreted strictly as a retelling of this Norse epical story. So you have these dwarves, and one of the things that Tolkien does to confirm to us that he sees something Jewish about them is that he gives them this language Khuzdul. And the language Khuzdul has a number of attributes to it that are uniquely Semitic. First of all, its grammar is Semitic grammar. You can see I chose the root KM KM is the root of singing. And by manipulating the vowels, the consonants surrounding that KM creating prefixes, suffixes, and infixes. In Hebrew, we call these binyanim. In Arabic, we call these awzan. By manipulating the combination of prefixes, suffixes, and infixes that surround this KM, I can change the meaning of the word, right? That's how I build on roots. So all of these are permutations of Kemeth that have been expanded post what Tolkien wrote. We know that he intended the language to be Semitic, and we have a few sentences like Baruch Chazad Chazad Aimenu and Balin Fundunul Uzbar Chazad Dumu from the Lord of the Rings text. Gimli shouts this Baruch Chazad Chazad Aimenu, asks the dwarves are upon you, and Gandalf reads Balin Fundunul Uzban Chazadumu when he discovers the tomb of Balin in Moria. But generally speaking, we don't see many of the writings of the dwarves, and they have to be expanded based on what knowledge we have by other linguists after the texts have been published. But Tolkien himself was very clear that the language was Semitic. And something to understand about how Tolkien chose to bring his languages to life is that he saw his languages as representations of the ways that people interacted with each other in Middle Earth. A perfect example was that Rohan, in his view, was a reimagining of the Anglo-Saxons if the Anglo-Saxons had horses. And so their language was actually very strongly derivative of Old English, to the effect that in one of the extended versions of the Two Towers movie, Peter Jackson has the people of Rohan sing a song just in Old English because we don't have enough Rohan language to extrapolate. And almost none of the very irascible Tolkien fans took him to task for this, given how similar Old English was to the language of Rohan. In the same way, Khuzdul is very similar to Hebrew in its construction in this sort of Semitic way. And is sort of a representation of the relationship with the Jewish people. I just wanted to point out, because some people might be interested, the words themselves of Khuzdul have no connection to Hebrew. There are a few words that we know of Khuzdul from Tolkien himself. Gamil, Baruch, and Zigil. Gamil in Khuzdul means old, but if you were to say Gamil to a Hebrew speaker, it would mean withdrawal, like from a drug. And the word for old in Hebrew is zakin or atik. And you can go down the line of what these things mean. In fact, zigil, the root zain gimel lamed, wouldn't even mean anything in Hebrew. The closest would be gazal, which is theft. So so the question becomes, right, what did Tolkien intend to demonstrate by choosing a Semitic language for the Jews? One of the things that he revealed in his conversation is that he believed that the accent of the Dwarvish language would impact the way that they spoke the common tongue. And so dwarves would be, despite living among speakers of Westron, the dominant language of Middle Earth, despite living among speakers of Westron, they would have their own unique accent that would be noticeable, very similar to the Jews who lived in other lands and still spoke, though, with an accent inflected from their knowledge of Hebrew. Another similarity is that Khuzdul is the language that dwarves did not share with any other beings. In fact, they only spoke it among their own people. They would speak Westron when speaking with others. And this is very similar to the fact that Jews kept Hebrew as an internal ceremonial language and didn't speak Hebrew with non-Jews. Yeah, anybody have questions up to this point?
I have quite a few. I mean, just on the last thing you said, I mean, the Jews didn't speak Hebrew with each other. Hebrew became a strictly ceremonial language of prayer and Torah study, but the languages that Jews used among themselves, as you very well know, were,
Yeah.
you know, depending on where you were in the world, Yiddish or in the Sephardic lands. So that's number one. And number two, a lot of the things that you're saying here, maybe there's similarities to the Jews, but they're not uniquely similarities to the Jews. So I feel that it's, you know, it's not as convincing as it would be if there was something we say, well, this is a link to the dwarves, to the Jews, and it's unique. You know, it's unique to the Jews and it's unique to the dwarves in Middle Earth. And I don't think that we've, you know, that we've passed that threshold.
Sure.
Can you give an example, Paul? I mean, who else?
Well, for example, the dwarves are heroic, like many of the, you know, the other people. I would imagine that there's lots of people that would be speaking Westeros with their own accent, just as we see in English. You know, there are so many different accents of English that it would be kind of bizarre to say, well, you know, saying that they had an accent means that they were Jewish. Well, maybe it means they were Spanish. Maybe it means they were Russian. Maybe it means they were Chinese.
Sure. To the latter point, dwarves are the only people that Tolkien has singled out as having a unique or discernible accent in their Westron speech. Sorry, that's not true. The only other example I can think of are the orcs. The orcs are told we're told that they have an accent when speaking Westron, but that is because their vocal cords are just not properly formed. Right? Orcs are some perversion by the Valar Melkor of elves. So because of the perversion, because of how they've been destroyed, they can't speak properly. And in fact, the language of Mordor, which is the language of Sauron, right, is a language that they can barely even speak. The language that they're supposed to be speaking as a native language is a language that they can't speak. But other than them, the dwarves are the only people that are noted as speaking with a clear, distinct accent relative to the others. But moreover, to the larger point, Tolkien always claimed that his stories were not allegorical, that they were applicable but not allegorical. And so you could see, for example, the Ring of Power as being representative of atomic bomb technology, right? And Sauron is Hitler, and the thing is, you have to destroy the atomic bomb technology to bring peace and prosperity to everybody. You could read Lord of the Rings like that in that sort of applicable lens, but that's not what he intended you to read it as. Because he didn't write it with
stories before the atom bomb, didn't he?
No, Fellowship of the Ring was written in the 50s.
And the Hobbit?
Hobbit was 37. But
well, that's where the ring
story,
starts.
right, but the destruction, the idea that the ring has to be destroyed, that there's a great conflict between Sauron and the Free Peoples, that doesn't show up in The Hobbit at all. In fact, if you read The Hobbit and had no idea about Lord of the Rings, it would be very difficult for you to have the idea that the ring itself was an evil device of this magnitude. Maybe it was an evil device of a lower magnitude. Maybe it was bitter or angry, but it wasn't this earth-shattering. Lord of the Rings really built The Hobbit, and then Tolkien actually went back and rewrote some of the scenes in The Hobbit to make the ring more evil. So but yeah, so I don't think any individual attribute on its own is enough. But I think when you see the number of different attributes that, okay, this could apply to Jews, but it could apply to a lot of other people. This could apply to Jews, but it could apply to a lot of people. When you see a number of these attributes in tandem, then it will start to look, I think, much more like a Jewish story.
Well,
But
let me suggest this.
Mhm.
I mean, what are the most outstanding attributes of the dwarves? To me, it's their propensity to like to live underground,
yep,
to delve huge caverns underground,
sure.
and they work with their hands. They build, tremendous devices. They are
Mhm.
they are military people. They're martial. They're not studious. They're not. And I mean, none of those things in my mind correlate with Jewishness.
Sure. But what are they digging for? They're digging for money. They're digging for wealth. And we're actually going to get to how the dwarves' economy is structured, and the high degree of specialization in the dwarves is actually very similar to the specialization with humans. I mean, we're gonna get into this, but there is a parallel in that. And even Tolkien himself, when he was saying what he saw as a parallel with the Jews, he actually saw the military capability of the dwarves as being similar to the military capability of the ancient Israelites, right? The Jews had this in them. So we're going to get to it. But so as we move through history, we'll see more of these examples. And you can continue to disagree or not. It's something that in the Tolkien fandom is something that's actively discussed, and there's no clear opinion one way or the other. So like all literature, this is something that's sort of open to interpretation.
I mean,
So
I do agree with you that there's, that Tolkien was using Semitic languages as a model,
yeah,
right? But
um,
that doesn't.
yeah.
But I guess, and you mentioned before that there's philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism. So I think what we're concerned about is invidious stuff.
Right. No, there's it's. I mean, I don't want to give away the plot here, but I think that Tolkien touches on a lot of different attributes of Jewish history and Jewish culture, and to a certain degree, I think that his picture is relatively balanced, despite him not intending to create that. So so we're going to talk first about Nargothrond. You can see on the map here, I've drilled into Beleriand. Nargothrond is the area circled in orange. And we're going to talk about the Blue Mountains as well. So that area is circled in the blue. So that should sort of give us our bearings as to where we are. Nargothrond, you can see in the upper right-hand side, is a massive cave structure. Now, Nargothrond was built by the petty dwarves. We said that these were the dwarves that were expelled from the other clans, and they made their way further west in order to avoid death at the hands of other dwarves. They decided to build a cave at Nargothrond, and at that point is when they encountered the elves. Not much is written about how the encounter between the petty dwarves and the elves went, other than that the elves committed a massive genocide against the petty dwarves. They were practically all exterminated. The only petty dwarf that we meet is towards the middle of the First Age. You have Mim. You can see Mim in the upper left-hand side. He's meeting a group of men. Those men are led by Turambar. You can sort of read more about his story in the Children of Húrin book. But Mim basically is encountered by these men, and they don't treat him very well. But he does manage to give them safety and security. But then they decide to plunder Nargothrond. Now, in the meantime, the elves have discovered Nargothrond and turned it into an elvish home below the ground, and have enjoyed access to all the dwarven riches that had existed there before the dwarves were eliminated. Turin comes there, and he discovers this place that had now, after the elves had built that structure, you can see the structure the elves had built. After the elves had built that structure, they too were forced to abandon it because a dragon had come. So Turin manages to kill the dragon, and he enters the facility. discovering the necklace of Nauglamir. We're going to talk more about that. But the important thing to see here is that, right, we have these dwarves. They've been expelled by other dwarves. And so they've been moved through no fault of their own into foreign territory. They try to build a home for themselves and then are the subject of extermination. In fact, the elves finally reach the Blue Mountains and they meet the dwarves of the Firebeards and the Broadbeams, who live those two clans that live in the mountains, and discover that the dwarves are not orcs. Right? They discover that the dwarves are a fully capable people, and then they seem to regret their genocide. But during the time of the petty dwarves, they don't seem to have this kind of relationship. Mime, in fact, curses the metal of Nargothrond as one of his last dying acts. The gold and the gems of Nargothrond is his last dying act. That all the people who profit from the destruction of his people would in turn come to violence and hatred. Mime is often considered by the Tolkien fandom to be one of the few evil dwarves that we have by name. But this may be from some of the earlier incantations of the story before the extent of the genocide and the destruction of his people was well established in Tolkien lore.
I mean, there's a marked similarity between that particular story and Siegfried's story.
Yes, there is.
Right?
Yeah.
But we should be aware that these stories are very early stories of Tolkien's, the stories of the First Age. They're basically the content of the Silmarillion.
Mm-hmm.
So they're written basically in World War I and its immediate aftermath. But clearly, this feels an awful lot like Siegfried.
Yes, and one of the things that we notice through Tolkien, if we look at him, from an out-of-universe perspective, is that his interpretation of the dwarves moves from the Silmarillion, where he's approaching it, the dwarves as more of Norse-style dwarves, these sort of trickster creatures, to a more egalitarian style of dwarf as we move through both his own life and the chronology in the timeline.
Hey, Richard?
Yeah.
You mentioned these exiled dwarves were not traditional enough. Is there anything more specific as to what they did to get themselves exiled?
We have throwaway lines, things like that they were lazy and sloven, they didn't know how to craft well, although we can see that that's not true because they created Nauglamir. We'll talk about that. But basically that they didn't that they were lazy, sloven, slothful, that sort of thing.
Okay.
So now we're going to talk about the story of the Nauglamir. Nargothrond and the Blue Mountains we know. And in the green is the Elven Kingdom of Doriath. So the Elven Kingdom of Doriath is ruled by King Thingol. So the story goes as this. So the dwarves, the petty dwarves, create the Nauglamir, which is this necklace. You can see it as Finrod Felagund, one of the elves, holds it aloft and admires its beauty. And they present it to Finrod. Eventually, Finrod comes to control Nargothrond after the petty dwarves have been eliminated. And for a long period of time, this necklace, Nauglamir, was in the ruins of that fortress. When Turin Turambar discovers it, he brings it to King Thingol of the elves in Doriath, and demonstrates how beautiful it is to them. At the same time, Thingol had recovered one of the Silmarils, which are ancient gems that had an irresistible light. That light would eventually come to the light of Erendil, which is the sort of flask that Frodo holds, right? So it's this beautiful light producing gem. And so Thingol approached the dwarves of Nogrod, likely Firebeards, although we don't have textual evidence to confirm that, likely the Firebeards, and asked them to incorporate this Silmaril, this beautiful gem, into the Nauglamir. And they do this, and they are so taken with its beauty that they refuse to hand it over to King Thingol, taking it for their own. King Thingol demands that they give it up, and so the dwarves of Nogrod actually attack King Thingol and slaughter the Elven Guard. You can see that image in the upper right-hand side. As the dwarves of Nogrod make their way back to the mountain, they are in turn attacked by Beren. Beren and Luthien being the ancestors of most of the major elves that we're familiar with, like Elrond, Arwen, Beren and Luthien. This is Beren. He kills the dwarves of Nogrod and brings the Nauglamir back to the elves. And this is very similar, as Paul undoubtedly knows, to a number of Norse epics where dwarves craft something beautiful but then decide to take it for their own. But it could also be read in the same sort of way. Dwarves take something beautiful and take it for their own. This doesn't seem to have a lot of Jewish parallels, but I wanted to present it so that we have a holistic picture of the dwarves. It can be read if you want to press a Semitic reading to it. It can have an anti-Semitic view of Jews not honoring their word, but on the contrary, most anti-Semitic perceptions are that Jews are too litigious with their word. I think Shylock here is probably the best example of that sort of caricature. All right. So any further questions on the story of the Nauglamir? All right. So at the end of the First Age, you have what's called the War of Wrath. And so you can see in the red circle, I've put Angband. Angband is the citadel of Melkor, also called Morgoth, who is the Valar who has turned against Eru Ilúvatar. Think Satan, that's the sort of the right idea, or Lucifer, right? He is the one who is responsible for the creation of the orcs. He is the one who is responsible for the creation of the Balrogs and of the dragons. Of course, these are not true creations. He does not possess the secret fire, but perversions of the beings that already exist in Middle-earth. And most of his antagonism is towards the elves. But for the first time in sort of Middle-earth history, the dwarves seem to be fighting on the side of good. Before, they were sort of neutral in this conflict, but now they are fighting on the side of good. And the dwarves we hear talked about are the dwarves of Belegost, which is the northern dwarves kingdom, the Broadbeam kingdom in the Blue Mountains, which you can see in the blue circle. So as you can see from the picture in the center, the War of Wrath is even more epic than anything we see in Lord of the Rings. The elven forces were fighting orcs. They were also fighting Balrogs. If you remember from Fellowship of the Ring, the Balrog is that gigantic, fiery creature that Gandalf encounters in the mines of Moria. There was an entire army of them at Morgoth, at Melkor Morgoth's disposal, and there were the dragons. And for the most part, the elves managed to hold their own against this large force. However, you can see Azaghal. Azaghal, you can see him in the lower right-hand side. He is the king of the dwarves of Belegost, and he is renowned for his heroism. Specifically, because the dwarves are made of stone in the mythology, they can withstand high temperatures, and their armor is specifically calibrated to protect them. So they are the ones who go after the dragons and are noted by the elves for their heroism. You can see in the lower left-hand side the dwarves of Belegost attacking a dragon. Azaghal himself dies, severely crippling and wounding the dragon Glaurung, who is the chief among the dragons at this point. So he is the first dwarf to receive positive mention by the elves. During this, this is sort of where I wanted to point out about wicked dwarves. We have scattered references in Tolkien's material to dwarves crafting items for the enemy, that they are in some cases in league with goblins or in league with orcs. We never actually see who these dwarves are. They're never mentioned by name. But to the extent that they exist, those are probably the dwarves in the Red Mountains, right? The dwarves, those 4 clans to the east. All right. Now to the dwarves that we know best. These are the Longbeards, and they exist in Moria. You can see Moria is in that mountain range, the Misty Mountains, that divides Eriador from Ravania. So we're much further east now. And Durin the First is the one who founds the kingdom of Khazad-dûm inside of Moria. Right, Moria is the name of the entire kingdom. Khazad-dûm is the interior of that kingdom, the inside of the mountain. And Durin the First comes in the First Age and establishes this place. And there's a prophecy that dwarves who resemble Durin will come in later periods, and they will have the same character and force of Durin. They will, in a sense, be future incarnations. This is the only nation about which this kind of prediction is ever made, but it seems almost messianic that you will have these future Durins and they will improve the country. In the reign and while Khazad-dûm is in dwarvish hands, it survives more or less intact for about 6,000 years. But with the Rings of Power, the dwarves began to delve even more deeply into the mountain and awaken one of the Balrogs that slept there. So the Balrog was awoken in the Third Age, and that forced the dwarves to escape Moria. Now, the reason they were digging so deep was that they were digging for mithril, this special metal that they can use to make incredible armor and defenses. The dwarves here were incredibly knowledgeable and in craft, and were often sought by neighboring peoples to build their armor and defenses. So, in particular, during the Second Age, there's a huge relationship between Moria, you can see it again circled in blue, and Eregion, the Elven region, circled in green. And this is one of the few times that we see a relationship between elves and dwarves that is a fruitful relationship. We can see here, this is the relationship between Celebrimbor. He is the elf who creates the rings, the great rings of power, right? The 3 rings of the elves, the 7 rings of the dwarves, and the 9 rings of men. The dwarven rings and the rings of men he creates with Sauron's assistance. The elven rings he creates on his own. But in addition to that, he did a number of collaborative works with Narvi, who was a dwarf of Khazad-dûm. And one of their collaborative works was the door of Western Moria, right? This would have been the door that the elves of Eregion would have used to enter Moria. It was carved with Ithilien, which is a dwarven technique for making runes that are visible in the moonlight. But you can see that the alphabet that they use is Tengwar, which is the Elvish alphabet, because Celebrimbor actually designed the carving. And if we remember from the Fellowship, the way to open this door is to speak the Elvish word for friend, right, to signify the relationship between Celebrimbor and Narvi. As pointed out, Celebrimbor creates the 7 great rings of power, and this is one of the few times we hear about all the dwarf clans, because all 7 of these dwarf clans, their rulers receive one of these 7 rings. Now, contrary to the men, because dwarves' hearts are more stout and resistant to evil, they become stronger in their attribute, and they're stronger in their greediness attributes, but they are not able to be corrupted in the same way that the men are. Perhaps this could be read as a Jewish parallel of how Jews manage to stay to their religion regardless of outside influences and pressures, whereas others are more susceptible. Tolkien doesn't make this allusion, but I think that the positive attributes of the dwarves also correlate to positive attributes in the Jewish community, and this is sort of one of them, where even the greatest evil that has infected the world has a lessened effect in their community. Still has an effect, but a lessened one. One of the things that's often discussed is that in the year 34 of the Second Age, King Gil-galad of the Elves and King Elendil of the men of Numenor confront Sauron on the plains outside of Mordor, and have their great fight of the last alliance of men and elves, where both are equally represented. The elves in decadence and the men in ascendancy. And the dwarves are not explicitly mentioned in that war, although we have information from the Alcalabeth, which is another shorter work of Tolkien's, that the dwarves did fight in this battle. They fought. There were some wicked dwarves that fought on Sauron's side, but far more important were the delegations of the Longbeards. Given their historic friendship with Eregion, the Longbeards sent their own dwarvish armies to fight in this last war.
Richard, can I have a
Yeah.
question? Well, so with these dwarf armies and stuff like that, would you say they're similar to like medieval armies, but they're like mercenaries? Are they like compensated? Are they given land or anything like that? And second question, do they marry amongst others or not really?
We
Like to
don't
build
know.
alliances?
Yeah. It doesn't seem like dwarves intermarry with non-dwarves. We do see numerous cases of elven men intermarriage. Right, Beren and Luthien. Beren is a man, Luthien is an elf. We see several cases of this. We never see dwarves intermarry with other races. In terms of in terms of the different clans intermarrying, we don't know because most of Tolkien's writings center on the story of the Longbeards. Gimli, as concerns dwarvish women, we have some information about them. Tolkien says that they are roughly 1/3 of the dwarvish population and are physically indistinguishable to non-dwarves as women. They have beards and stocky bodies, just like the men do. And most of these women don't even produce children because they may be in love with a dwarf who doesn't reciprocate their feelings, or there may be too many men who are interested in crafting and not interested in relationships. And in fact, in the entire Legendarium, we only have the mention of Dis, who is the sister of Thorin. She is the only female dwarf who's even mentioned, and she's mentioned offhand. So we don't know about what dwarven relations look like. In terms of the military, Tolkien doesn't really address economics. My intuition is that the dwarves in the military are paid from the same golden sums and coffers of these kingdoms. I would guess it would be something along a medieval structure, because most of Tolkien's world is relatively medieval. But he doesn't really deal with that. There's a famous meme on the internet that J.R.R. Martin, the George Martin, the creator of the Sword and Fire series, says, Tolkien's greatest failure is that he doesn't write out economics. So that might be an empty spot here.
Okay, cool.
So one of the things that I sort of discussed earlier is that there's this sort of trade specialization. We have no references in the text that dwarves actually grow their own food. And we have numerous instances, such as the words of Thorin, where they talk about how they would trade their craft with men, and then men would provide food or other farmed goods in compensation. And in fact, we only see dwarvish cities really develop and grow if they have good functional relationships with other beings beside them. Most of the time, it's going to be men. In the case of Khazad-dûm and Eregion, it was the elves. But in either case, the dwarves seem to be outsourcing the maintenance of the civilization to men, and then those men will trade with the dwarves for their smithing. We have cases with the Lonely Mountain, where the men of Dale would send their kids to Erebor, to the Lonely Mountain, to learn how to smith. But still, generally speaking, they trusted the dwarves' handiwork more than their own. And we have numerous cases where the dwarves will build these sort of smith creations for the men, such as designing the gates of Minas Tirith after the events of Return of the King, when they had been smashed down by the Witch King's armies. And we have this constant motif that dwarves trade. That's how they make their income, because despite the fact that they can mine gold, they need to eat, and they don't seem to have a fondness for growing things. in a certain way, this could be seen as a parallel to the Jewish hyper-specialization, where in most Western countries, Jews occupy only a certain set of professions that are highly specialized and are not heavily involved in agronomy or in the basic maintenance of civilization.
But the Jews are not known for working with their hands. The Jews are not known as smiths. Jews are known for administrative functionality.
They're yeah, administrative functioning, but I mean, banking is pretty similar to the kind of wealth mining that dwarves do. And as for working with their hands, Jews do have a history of artisanry in the places where it wasn't prohibited, right? In Yemen, there's a traditional Jewish silversmith culture. In Morocco, in the city of Essaouira, there's a similar silversmith culture. So in places where Jews are actually permitted to work with their hands, there is actually a history of Jewish artisanry. But yes, I agree. It's a looser fit than for example, the Semitic nature of their language. Now, after the Balrog shows up in Moria, Durin's folk, the Longbeards, leave Moria and move into the Grey Mountains. You can see in the upper part of the map that's circled. At this point, they begin to attract the attention of the remaining dragons. So there are these dragons in the north, and they attack Durin's folk and plunder their mountains. Of course, the most famous of these is Smaug, who takes the city of Erebor for his own. But there are numerous dragons that force the dwarves into this massive period of wandering. So you can see the ice drakes, the dragons that, as well as the fire-breathing dragons that took the lands of the north and forced the dwarves to migrate. And one of the things that is unique among the dwarves, as opposed to the other races of Middle Earth, is that the dwarves are constantly migrating. If you look, if you look at the red line, that number 1, that's the first migration of the Longbeards from Mount Gundabad to Moria. Then you can see the yellow lines of the dwarves of Belagost and Nogrod, the Blue Mountains. A number of their people migrated to Moria after the destruction of Beleriand, right? And their cities in the War of Wrath. So they made their way to Moria. Then from Moria, they made their way to Erebor. From Erebor to the Grey Mountains. From the Grey Mountains to Erebor and the Iron Hills. Then they were expelled from Erebor. They made their way to Dunland. You can follow all these arrows around. From Dunland, some of them made their way back to the Blue Mountains. This includes Thorin and company. They made their way from Dunland to the Blue Mountains. Then from the Blue Mountains, they go back to Erebor, where they are finally able to reestablish their civilization under Dane the Second Ironfoot. So, and then finally, at the end of the Third Age, they make their way back to Moria under Durin the Seven, the Deathless. So you have this constant moving of dwarves. You can in fact see the final migrations in blue, right? There's the migration back to Moria, and there's also the migration to Aglarond, the Glittering Caves in Helm's Deep, where Gimli decides to have a small dwarvish clan of his own. So you have this sort of constant migration from place to place because of ensuing tragedies at each place, right? In Moria, the Balrog comes. In the Grey Mountains, and Erebor, the dragons come. In Dunland, they're open to attack from the wild men. So in the Blue Mountains, they're accepted, but only to a certain degree, and they don't generate the wealth and prestige that they did elsewhere. And so, for a variety of reasons, they keep moving from place to place in search of a place to call home. And of course, this is very similar to the Jewish experience, where Jews were routinely forced to move from place to place throughout Europe because of discriminatory laws. Probably the most interesting part of the dwarvish experience in Dunland, you can see here on the map where Dunland is relative to Moria, The dwarves' experience in Dunland was that um, you have the war of dwarves and orcs, and some of this is recounted in the movie, the Hobbit movie, um, where King Thror, but it's recounted in the Hobbit movie very differently than how it is in the books and in the lore. So, in the books, King Thror, who has been forced out of Erebor by the dragon Smaug, decides he wants to look upon the halls of his fathers, um, Moria of Khazad-dûm, and so he goes in there with his friend Nod. But although two of them go in, only one comes out. The goblins attack Thror and throw his head on the ground, and they tell Nar to take a message to the rest of the dwarves that Moria belongs to the goblins and that the dwarves should go away. The dwarves take this insult very seriously, and the Longbeards are able to gather allies from all of the dwarf clans and make a march against the goblins of the mountains. And this war goes on for about 6 years throughout the Misty Mountains, with a final battle occurring outside the eastern gate of Moria. This is the gate that the Fellowship exits when they make their way from Moria to Lorien. And at this battle, Azog the Defiler, the lead goblin, is killed by Dane Ironfoot, who is this young dwarf who's taking the place of his father. And this is the Battle of Azanul-Vizar, the Battle of the Eastern Gate. And upon killing Azog, the dwarves proclaim victory, but it is a Pyrrhic victory. Numerous dwarven casualties lay strewn about the mountain, and when Thrain, Thror's son, says, "Let us go into Moria, let us take back the mountain," the rest of the dwarves basically say, "No, we fought for our kin, and we took back our name, but we're not going there. Those aren't the halls of our fathers, and the Balrog is still there." And then we have the quest for the Lonely Mountain. As you can see, they move from the Thorin's company moves from the Blue Mountains through the Shire, where they meet Bilbo. They make their way to Rivendell over the mountains through Mirkwood until they arrive at the Lonely Mountain. We also need to point out that Dane Ironfoot, that's Victor in the War of Dwarves and Orcs, comes to rule over a small dwarvish kingdom of his own in the Iron Hills. So, right. So the quest for the Lonely Mountain is really the story of the Hobbit, but it's the story of the Hobbit from the dwarvish perspective, right? So you have Thorin, and this reads almost similarly to a story of historic reclamation of stolen lands, right? So you have these dwarves. This is their kingdom that they've lost to the dragon, and they make their way across numerous difficulties in Middle Earth to reach the mountain. The dragon is slain, and they take their home back as it once was. In a certain sort of overarching sense, it can be seen similarly to the Jewish reclamation of the state of Israel, right? You have the Jews who've been dispossessed, who've been moving from place to place because they were kicked out by a power greater than their own, and they're able to return to their homeland and build their own society back, not without antagonism from the other peoples in the area, in the vicinity, right? The reason that this parallel exists is that once Thorin returns, the elves and men want compensation for what was taken from them by Smaug, and this results in a war where Thorin sides to protect that which is his in his own view. In this sort of analog, Bilbo can almost be seen as taking the role of the British, in that he helps guide Thorin and company from the Shire to the mountain, and manages to retrieve the Arkenstone, which is the stone that the dwarves need to secure their own legitimacy. You can see the Arkenstone above Thorin on the throne chair. But even with Erebor, there's still the desire to return to Moria. So 30 years after retaking Moria, Balin, one of the members in Thorin's company, along with two other members, Ori and Owen, Owen being the uncle of Gimli, decide to take a clan of dwarves back to Moria. And for a while, they managed to revive that civilization, but eventually the goblins overtake them. And you can see Ori writing the records that Gandalf will read when they were in Balin's funeral room inside his burial chamber, where the Fellowship encounters the goblins of Moria. The dwarves will only finally be able to take back Moria, despite returning under Thor, despite returning under Balin, with Durin the Seventh in the Fourth Age, after all the battles of Return of the King. And since Durin the Seventh is supposed to be the final reincarnation of Durin the First, it can almost be seen like a messianic return to the historic land that they had been dispossessed from. Gimli represents a huge evolution in sort of Tolkien's framing and ideology about the dwarves, where Gimli begins to show a number of positive attributes. And Tolkien writes it in such a way that Gimli's positive attributes are more representative of his race as a whole, and not just Gimli as an individual, and increasingly contextualizes Thorin's interest in money and wealth as being a personal issue as opposed to a dwarvish issue overall. One of the interesting parallels we see is the interaction between Gimli and Galadriel, where Gimli recognizes that she is the fairest among all beings and requests a hair from her golden head only because she demanded that he ask her for a present when leaving. All the other members of the Fellowship also received gifts. And what's telling about this interaction is that she provides him 3 hairs. This is in contrast to when she lived in the First Age, and the elf Feanor demanded 1 hair from her on 3 different occasions in order to perfect some of the jewels he was creating. That her hair was so beautiful that it would be the inspiration for that. She denied him, but she accepted Gimli's request, meaning that she saw in him a pure heart that she did not see in Feanor. Despite Feanor being of her kindred and Gimli being of the dwarves. And the dwarves and elves, of course, have a lot of enmity between them. The other positive attributes we sort of talked about, Gimli shows a very stout heart in battle. He's very determined. In contrast to the movies, Gimli of the book is actually quite serious. The Gimli of the book is quite serious. Sorry? Yeah, Gimli of the book is quite serious, and yeah, he gives his all in many of these battles, and he puts his life on the line for the other members of the Fellowship. We also see that there's a turning point in his relationship with Legolas, and the turning point is really in Helm's Deep, where they're in the glittering caves behind the fortress, and Gimli remarks of how beautiful it is that he's in these glittering caves and how wonderful and marvelous they are. And Legolas says something to the tune of, "Won't you just quarry all of that away?" And Gimli looks at him, "No, we respect beautiful things too. We just respect them beneath the earth. We have our own appreciation of this, and we would not quarry this kind of stone." Which shows that there is sort of a similar, that dwarves have the same appreciation that elves do. They just have an appreciation for something different. And it's not just the craft of their own hands. They can recognize naturally occurring beauty as well. So this, in my view, this is sort of as Tolkien sees the dwarves more and more as representatives of Jews than the Norse creatures that they were in the earlier iterations, and they begin to show much more interest in having relations with the other races. They are shown to have an understanding of beauty, of music, and a similar temperament to the other races, and so that they are an equal part of the free world. And finally, during the attack on Minas Tirith, Dale and Erebor are also attacked by the forces of Mordor. King Dane is around 250 years old at this point, the end of his life as a dwarf. But he stands with King Brand of Dale, who's the grandson of Bard, the Dragon Slayer, who killed Smaug. And the two of them fight an army of Easterlings and orcs 2 days after the Battle of Minas Tirith. Both of these kings are killed. Brand is killed first, and King Dane defends his body until he too is killed. Their sons inherit the mantle of kingship and drive away the forces of Mordor. It's critical to see that the dwarves are fighting as equals with the men, and it's a true demonstration of their treaty of friendship and amity, that they fight so strongly side by side. So that sort of is the story of the dwarves, and as I said, we can see some Jewish elements. We have the language, we have the migration, we have this sort of persecution, we have the exile from their homeland, we have these sort of elements, and we have their sort of relationship with other nations being necessary because they don't engage in the fundaments of agronomics. But at the same time, as Paul has pointed out, there are a number of distinctions, right? They're much more famous for the craft of their hands. They have this sort of beginning that resembles much more of Norse mythology than it does Jewish history, and they are physically different than men. Whereas, of course, in our world, Jews are equally human, and so can intermarry with non-Jews.
So
Yeah.
in the, I mean, I think there are definitely some compelling things to make one think that Tolkien did have Jews in mind, and I think that he has admitted it.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think the important question really is, do you think that it's anti-Semitic, or I mean, just the fact that it represents Jews in some way doesn't make it an attack on Jews?
I actually don't think it's anti-Semitic. I think that he creates enough positive attributes about the dwarves, and he shows the dwarven sacrifice in a way that Jews have also sacrificed. One of the Mark Twain is known as being rather philosemitic. He wrote the essay concerning the Jews, which is probably one of the most philosemitic tomes I've ever read. And in that, he says, if I could make one negative critique of the Jews, they don't serve in the military. And after that, he was flooded with letters. And so he actually wrote a follow-up where he said, after doing a statistical analysis, I realized that I was just operating off of prejudice. Jews in the US Army exist in greater numbers than their proportion of the population, and have done throughout the majority of US history. And he was right in this. During the US Civil War, 10,000 Jews enlisted, about 7,000 for the North and 3,000 for the South. And which was, as a percentage of the Union and Confederate armies, was larger than their percentage of the overall population. Jews had commanders in the Navy as early as 1840, and their integration in the military was what was significant in the countries that would have them in the military. So this perception that Jews don't fight, that Jews are sort of parasitic in that way, is itself not true. And it's something that Tolkien, by giving the dwarves this militant character that he believes he modeled off of the Jews, sort of gives voice to that positive aspiration of Judaism, that they're willing to fight and defend those that they believe in, despite whether those people are dwarves or not. Right? The King Dane II defends the body of King Brand until he himself is slain, is the same kind of courage and devotion he did when he fought over the dead body of his father at the Battle of Azanul-Bisar, right? So you have this sort of parallel of treatment, and you also see the way that Gimli interacts with the members of the Fellowship treating them all as equals, and willing to risk his own life for Frodo at the Battle of Moradon Gate, right? The battle at the Black Gate.
I would suggest, I mean, first of all, in evaluating Tolkien's work, it's really necessary to see the development of it. You know,
Mhm.
people think of the Tolkien that, you know, who wrote the Silmarillion as being the same as the Tolkien who wrote The Hobbit and the same as the Tolkien who wrote The Lord of the Rings. But, you know, this covered 50 years of his life or more.
Mhm.
My thinking is that well, first of all, Tolkien has made numerous anti-Nazi statements.
Absolutely.
He loathed the Nazis.
I think probably the clearest statement is when he was asked to translate his book The Hobbit into German, and he was asked by the publishers in Germany whether or not he had any Jewish blood in him, and he said something along the lines of, "I am unfortunate to say that I have no blood from that blessed race," or something
Right.
along those lines.
Right, I don't have the honor.
I don't have the honor, exactly.
So what I, you know, I mean, what
No,
I
no,
would
I don't-
suggest is
I don't
that as he watched Nazi Germany and watched what happened there, I think he became more aware of the power of negative stereotypes.
I think that's right.
And he then realized that this was something that he couldn't let lie. He had to address it. He had to make it clear that that there was no anti-Semitic intention in his work, just the opposite.
I think that's right. I don't want to leave anybody with the conclusion that I think that Tolkien or Rowling are anti-Semites. On the contrary, both of them were very prolific and clear in their statements in opposition to anti-Semitism. And Tolkien, especially when it was a lot more acceptable to be anti-Semitic, made clear that that he wasn't. But the point is whether or not the fictional work incorporates some of this, some of the perceptions of Jews, and I think that the dwarves do represent positive attributes about Jews and negative attributes about Jews, just as Jews themselves have positive and negative elements in their own history.
Question for you: do you think that the orcs represent Slavs? Are there similarities in their languages?
I'm not aware because the language of Mordor doesn't sound like Slavic language at all.
Okay.
If anything, it sounds like it sounds closer to Dwarvish in terms of its use of consonants and vowel placement. You could make the argument that orcs are Slavs. I think a better, I think much more likely is that if we want to go for outside of Western European representation, I would look at the men. You have the Haradrim of the south who ride Oliphants, which are very reminiscent of Hannibal's march across northern Europe with elephants. So the Haradrim come from the south. It could be a representation of Africans. You have the Southrons and the Corsairs, who are also very swarthy, described as so. And Corsair in our world was actually a term applied to Arab pirates who attacked the south of Europe, and the Corsairs attacked the southern ports of Gondor. You have the Easterlings and the people of Run, who are sallow-skinned, Tolkien's words, and so they seem to represent the great Mongol hordes of the east. So, like, if you're looking for like that kind of negative human allegory, I would actually go to the wicked men. I wouldn't go to the orcs. I think the orcs are pretty clearly something else.
Question, Richard. Great presentation, by the way. Is this like a circulating theory that's been around for a while, or is this something that you just came across recently?
No, this is actually when I wasn't aware of the theory until I started reading up on it, a few years ago. But when I was a kid, I remember reading The Hobbit, and it just jumped out to me as Zionism. At least that's how I felt about it, and I always got so let down by how broken Thorin was. Because to me, like, I was like, oh, Bilbo's this random idiot who just managed to find his way onto this adventure. The real story is that Thorin Oakenshield is moving from the Blue Mountains to Erebor to take back his homeland, which So it's always funny to me because when I hear when most people read it, they're angry that the dwarves have more emphasis. For example, in the Peter Jackson remake, that it's more of a dwarvish story than it is a Bilbo story, and sometimes it gets lost in the movie. And it's funny to me because for me, I always read it as a Thorin story, and Bilbo just got tacked along. Um, but there's definitely multiple opinions about this in the literature. And it goes back to the 1990s where this is really discussed. And people sort of have difficulty, especially if they're more progressive in their orientation, reconciling Tolkien with sort of modern understandings of racial equality and justice. But especially on the Wicked Men, as I pointed out. But the dwarves is something that is contentious because of the Norse origins of the dwarves and his development over the course of his life, as Paul has pointed out.
Okay.
I just thought it was interesting, and it's one of those things where, as Aaron said, we're actually on YouTube. We're actually making videos. I couldn't find a single YouTube video about this. So if people are somehow interested in this topic, then they can see sort of the length of this story and how it applies.
Appreciate it. I have a question.
Yeah.
So Gandalf sides with dwarves. Does any of this has to do with I mean, obviously being him not anti-Semitic, Tolkien, and then therefore making dwarfs to be more a positive figure because of that? And obviously they were not on the dark side; they were on the side of light, so to speak. And another question is stemming to the movie, and maybe this is a stupid question, but the fact when that creature finds the ring and talks about precious, which is the most important part of it, does anything to do with maybe somehow citing the fact that that's anti-Semitic? And also a third one, there's a little bit, you also have alluded that Jews were more studious, and kind of remembers the fact that when Napoleon army was marching into Russia, and the reason Russians hated Jews, because they supplied alcohol and provisions to the French army while they were marching, Grand Army was marching into Russia, and Russians were like, what the hell are you doing? You're part of, but Russia's been abusing Jews for so long that's almost like, they saw a French army, and we also know that French had had more freedom rules for Jews. So to me, it's like here it's also, he's depicting them as being more, not opportunistic, but in a nice sense of that they're more resourceful, so to speak, and they can kind of work with it, stuff like that.
Sure. To address your points in reverse, I agree with you that he's sort of pointing out how the dwarves have to choose their trading partners, but the dwarves have to have a trading partner because they don't grow anything, right? And dwarves eat, so if you don't grow, you die. And so oftentimes it's partnerships with men because of their antipathy towards the elves, stemming from a long history of abuses, right? We didn't talk about this, but during the journey towards Erebor, the dwarves were taken prisoner by the king of Mirkwood, Thranduil, and the elves never apologized for this. So you have all these sort of interactions, and dwarves are more reticent to trust the elves with that sort of duty. But yeah, there is that. Can you remind me your other 2 points?
So, and you kind of addressed one of the points, is like he's portraying the fact that he's not anti-Semitic is almost, pitting Jews again on the right side, or the human side, or so to speak. But you kind of addressed that a little bit. But also that was part of him saying, look, I'm putting them in the right context. But yet to me, like, for example, and maybe I'm going into, wrong here, but depicting Muhammad, for example, right? I mean, this is not absolutely depicting Muhammad going there, that, or depicting a Muslim person always could be misconstrued pro-against in Arab world as being anti-Arab, so to speak. So in here, I mean, we're talking about 50s here, right? So he's depicting Jews, even though he's pitting them on the right side, but could this be also misconstrued anti-Semitic? How could you have this deformed human beings shown as being Jews? You know what I'm saying? That's what, to me, it's a little bit, or maybe misconstrued being as Jews. That's what I'm saying.
Sure. One of the more famous writings on this is that the idea that that points to this is basically that the very idea that Jews are a distinct race, that that there is an official dividing line between dwarves and men, or dwarves and elves, that it's not like men and elves where they can intermarry, but that there's this finite line, is an instantiation of racialism, right? This idea that there are races that are distinct entities, as opposed to a flowering humanity that is multipolar, and has people from different places and with different experiences, but we can all come together as one unity. That was her, I forget her name, but that was her major indictment of this, is that even if you accept that Tolkien's representation of Jews as dwarves is a good representation, or a positive representation, either one, it still promotes the idea of racialism. But you can't really escape racialism in Tolkien, because there are different nations and different peoples who are occupying this Middle Earth. An orc can't be good. Like, people have been asking, like, is there a good orc? And there is some idea that the descendant of orcs that interbred with humans might possibly be good, but then again, you have interbreeding with humans, and so that's not really a true orc. There is this sort of set in the world. That said, there are wicked dwarves. We never hear about them directly by name, but there are wicked dwarves that fashion tools and instruments of the enemy. It just happens that none of the dwarves that we are concerned with, and none of the dwarves that build these large homelands, especially from the Longbeards, are involved with this. And actually, a fun thing about the Arabs, right? I talked about the Corsairs. The only other possible Arab character I've seen is Ran-Borigan, who doesn't show up in the movies but is in Return of the King, the book. And he is the leader of the Jurdan forest. And he helps Theoden march to Gondor in only to Minas Tirith in only 3 days by using a secret route that only he knows and his people know. And Aragorn respects this alliance by later making the Jurdan forest Ran-Borigan's kingdom, and outside of the direct authority of the unified realm of men. So, but of course, Ran-Borigan could also be Celtic, and that's more likely. But the way that his name is written sounds almost Arabic by pronunciation.
We have Carissa that raised hand. Thank you for the response, Richard. Carissa, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I apologize if this question's too elementary, but am I correct in that? So if I think it was the Hobbit was around 1937, and then we have like the official beginning of World War II around 39. Was this is kind of a strange question, and maybe you already covered this. I apologize for coming in late and absolutely knowing
Not a problem.
very little about this. And thank you for your presentation, by the way. But is this kind of like a countermeasure from the side? Because I know that Nazi propaganda, the way they propagated these stereotypes, and I don't know if it was novel at the time, but is this kind of like a countermeasure coming at it from the side, as they were kind of coming up with newer approaches of propagating these stereotypes and promoting? I don't even know what you would. I don't even know. Did that make a question?
I'm struggling to understand it. Let me try and make it a question, and you can tell me if I've understood you correctly.
I like that.
So The Hobbit being written in 1937, was that an attempt somehow by Tolkien or by the British in general to create a new vision of what Jews are, and therefore subvert the propaganda and instrumentation of the Nazis during the same period?
Yeah, and I'm not saying that literature hasn't been used as a countermeasure against stereotyping before, but could this have possibly been, I mean, could that have been one of the reasons we even have The Hobbit today, or some of his literature?
I don't think that Tolkien was writing from the perspective that his writing would create a Philosemitic wave in the public. I don't think that that was his aim at all. I think the story that he told in The Hobbit was a Bilbo-centric story. As I said, I read the story of The Hobbit as a Thorin-centric story because Thorin was the character that I related to. Right, this is the Jew who's going back to reclaim his homeland. That's the way I read the story. But the way that Tolkien wrote the story is Bilbo is representative of a quintessential English person, right? A very common, and Tolkien has made clear that the hobbits are representative of people from the Midlands, right? That they're these normal people who throw parties. Their great aim in life is to grow, a nice garden and to taunt their neighbors, right? Like that's the Hobbit life, and eating 15 meals a day. So it's the quintessential story of this English person being taken out of his, calm English upbringing and showing that these values, these homeschool values, are somehow better than the values of war and the values of the great folk, right? Because hobbits are physically diminutive, right? They're between 3 and 4 feet tall. They don't match the heights and the feats of even the dwarves, let alone the men and the elves, who are the men who are 6 foot and the elves who are just over 6 foot, right? So they're very diminutive. But the point is that their size and their lack of abject heroism doesn't really matter. What matters is that they bring the spirit of calmness and kindness, right? A perfect example in the story of The Hobbit is that when Bilbo recovers the Arkenstone, he brings it to Bard, the man, and Thranduil, the Elven King, saying, "I see Thorin's heart, and this treasure has dragon sickness on it. It's worsening Thorin as a person. I'm giving you this Arkenstone to negotiate with him with, because I believe in Thorin the person, not the person he's become." And it's that sort of understanding of people that Bilbo has in a way that the men, the elves, and the dwarves really don't have, and that's what Gandalf really saw in Bilbo, this understanding of humanity, as well as his ability to be light on his feet, right? That's how he sells Bilbo to the dwarves. But that Bilbo is this sort of good-natured English person, and it's those values that make the world a better place. And when Bilbo is put, in this crucible, he's the one who makes things turn out properly. He's the one who leads the dwarves against their own devices by thinking intelligently. He's the one who thinks outside the box and sees their humanity. So that's the story that I think Tolkien was trying to tell in The Hobbit. The dwarven story of these exiles reclaiming their homeland, I think, is the secondary tale. Does that answer your question?
I think I showed up with a toothpick to a gunfight. I'm sorry. Yeah, more than adequately. Thank you.
It's a good question, but I just want to make sure that I answered it to your satisfaction. Okay. Anybody else before we move on to JK?
Paul is talking, but he's mute.
Oh, who's
Paul,
talking?
you're mute.
Who's talking?
Paul.
Paul,
Yeah. I was going to say that to me, any sort of political reading of Tolkien is really very, very secondary. Tolkien is his most important affiliation is his Catholicism,
Right.
And in all of his work, it's much more a moral allegory than a historical allegory or a political allegory. There are good and bad in every community, with the exception of the orcs, where there's only bad. But the Fëanor that Richard commented was an elf, who, in some ways, the Silmarils were like the prototype of the Ring. They were this thing that caused overwhelming greed and desire for possession, and ended up destroying, creating civil war among the elves, in which the different tribes of the elves killed each other in very large numbers, and had Fëanor's son swore an oath to kill anybody that tried to possess a Silmaril, which were mostly other elves for a while. But the other things that are happening during Tolkien's life are the gradual erosion of the English village. And clearly Tolkien has this nostalgic love for English village life, and he wants to make the point that little people matter. And so the hobbits are little ordinary British people who are not heroic, who are not big movers and shakers, but they are the people that save the world, right? They're just their basic decency saves the world. And he shows again and again how people can be tempted through power of all different races, right? Saruman, who is,
J.R.R.
right, he's one step below the Valar. He's a minor angel, if you will, as is Gandalf, as are the Balrogs. So it's really about showing the triumph of good and the triumph of compassion and love, and incidentally valor and courage.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Tolkien's primary purpose was to tell a story about themes and morals more than it was about any political situation that existed in the day. I think that the applicability of Tolkien shows how much those values endure beyond the strict reading of the text.
And the notion of salvation,
right?
That that everything can be turned around. There's the Messiah can come. They can destroy the ring.
Exactly. No, one of the things that people sort of don't understand is why Frodo was the one who had to take the ring to Mordor and not, some, powerful elf or man or dwarf, batting down, all the enemies and just making a beeline right to Mordor. And the thing is that on that route, the ring would have corrupted that person. It's that Frodo had those English country values, that he didn't want any power or aggrandizement, and so the ring had far less to work with in terms of his personality to corrupt him, and that's why. And despite the ring working really hard to corrupt him, ultimately Frodo makes it to Mount Doom. He doesn't manage to put the ring in. The ring has the ability to corrupt him enough to prevent him from putting the ring in the mountain, but he manages to make it all the way to the mountain, which I don't think any of the great people would do, simply because of their own ability to be corrupted.
And it's interesting, right? So Gollum, despite himself, saves the human race and the elfish race and all these different races, right?
Yeah.
And Gollum has a spark of humanity in him. He came from somebody that was essentially a proto-hobbit before it started. He wasn't a dwarf. He was a hobbit.
Exactly.
And the idea that the New Testament idea that the weak shall be great and the great shall be small, right? That's the overwhelming idea. Is that right? That these humble of the earth are the most important, and the great of the earth are vain, but the humble of the earth are the ones that really matter.
Exactly. Any last questions before we go to JK? Now, compared to what we talked about with the dwarves, there's a lot less to say about the goblins, simply because J.K. Rowling didn't spend 50 years of her life crafting their history. What we do know are several distinct instances. So the first time that we hear about goblins is that they're ruled by a king called Ragnuk I, and his territories seem to exist somewhere in the British Isles. In Tolkien's universe, the magical countries of Britain and Ireland are still united throughout the entirety of wizarding history, as far as we know, up until the present day. The Irish did not become their own separate country. So Ragnarok I's reign could be anywhere in the British Isles. And he was asked by Godric Gryffindor to create a magical sword. In the Harry Potter universe, goblins have unique smithing abilities, and they are able to forge weapons that wizards cannot match. So Ragnarok I forges this sword for Godric Gryffindor, and he lays within it rubies in its hilt, and he presents it to Godric Gryffindor, but then decides that he wants the sword himself, that he wants to have possession of it, and then tells his fellow goblins that Godric Gryffindor stole it from him. Those dwarves then confronted Gryffindor. Gryffindor killed them all with the sword, and told King Ragnarok that he was keeping the sword as he rightfully paid for it. If you're hearing echoes of the Nauglamir story, you're not alone. This seems very, very similar to that exact idea, right? There's precious metals given. The goblin forges it using his superior smelting technology, and refuses to surrender the item when requested, and results in the killing of many of his kindred in reclamation of the item. One of the things that Tolkien really brings, sorry, not Tolkien, that Rowling really brings home with the goblins is that goblins have a strong concept of ownership. That the goblins believe that they own all things that they make with their own hands. That wizards only own the things that for the time that they are alive. It's sort of like a rental of the item, and it should devolve back to the goblins who made it. That money itself is their own creation, and it's imprinted with the stamp of the goblin who makes it, and their ability to write metals is what allows them to make unique coins that can't be counterfeited. Their armor is highly sought after, and but it ultimately belongs to them and not to the wizards who take it. That their concept of ownership is not enforced is simply a result of wizards having more political power, not because goblins have acquiesced to this system of ownership. In some ways, this can be considered similar to the stereotype of the Jews, that the Jews hoard their wealth, right? And that they don't believe that anybody else should have access to their wealth. And yeah. Gringotts itself as a bank was established in... Okay. Okay. You've got Gringotts here. Gringotts was the first wizarding bank, as far as we can tell. We don't know about ones in other countries, so there may have been earlier ones. But this was the British Wizarding Bank. Of course, it was run entirely by goblins, and that running was autonomous from the Wizarding Society at large, despite the fact that this was the creation of the currency in the Wizarding world. We can see that wizards have very weak power over it in numerous the conversation between Travers and Hermione in Deathly Hallows, where Travers admits that the economy wouldn't work but for the goblins. And we see in conversations with Griphook that one of the things that Voldemort tries to do is change the historic way that the bank has been run, which is that it's been run by goblins from the top down. As you can see, the idea of a bank, a wealthy bank run entirely by Jews, fits into a number of Jewish stereotypes. During the Middle Ages, we see that there are a number of crimes under which dwarves suffer. Probably the worst of these that we have that is enumerated is the story of Yardley Platt. Yardley Platt was a wizard who was a serial goblin killer. Other than the fact that he killed numerous goblins, we don't know anything about him. We don't even know, for example, if he was arrested by the Wizengamot and put on trial for his crimes against other beings. It's likely, given the hostility between wizards and goblins throughout this period, that he wasn't. And of course, the murder of sentient living beings not being treated seriously is a major reason for declining relations between the two groups. We know from Rowling's writings outside of strictly the Harry Potter books themselves, but through her wombat tests that she published online, that there were goblin rebellions in 1612, 1752, and 1850. There are several reasons that are posited for why these different rebellions occur. There's the story of Urg the Unclean, who appears to have revolted after wizards forced his head underwater and nearly drowned him. You have the situation where Nagnok, who was a goblin security guard at Gringotts, was killed by a poorly trained security troll and blamed the ministry for it. You have a revolt in 1612 in Hogsmeade that came after there was a vote in the Wizengamot, which is the wizarding judicial authority and conference, and they denied goblins entry. That one seems to be probably the most reasonable of these revolts, but you have these revolts occurring, and the goblins are clearly a violent race with respect to the wizards, who have been denying them an equal status in the country. One of the ironies that we have to consider is that the wizards had the statute of secrecy since the 1680s, so the rebellion of 1612 could well have occurred with Muggles being aware of it, except that it happened in Hogsmeade. Since Hogsmeade is the only wizard-only village in the UK, perhaps the Muggles were unaware. During the 1752 and 1850 rebellions, necessarily the wizards would have been caught on both sides. They would have had to put down the Goblin Rebellion while at the same time hiding all of this from Muggle eyes who might see this. We don't know the extent to which the goblins are complicit or adherent to the international statute of secrecy. We also see that there's a description of goblin rights and wizard relations. Probably the most famous person involved here is Oswald Beamish. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, he was a wizard advocate for goblin rights and consulted with numerous goblin rights organizations. It was under his guidance that the Ministry of Magic established its Goblin Liaison Office. It had existed before, but it was more properly organized under his tutelage. He set up, because first you have the regulation and control of magical creatures, and then below the regulation and control of magical creatures, there are two divisions. There are the Beast Division and the Being Division. And the Being Division concerns creatures of approximate human intelligence, and goblins were shifted into the Being Division. Other beings are things like centaurs, for example, and we note from the text of Harry Potter that centaurs have the ability to communicate and understand things. The phrasing of being at or near human intelligence is something that goblins and both goblins and centaurs find insulting, considering they believe themselves to be more intelligent than people, despite the fact that they have been repressed by them. A symbol of this repression was the Fountain of Magical Brethren, which existed in the Ministry of Magic, which shows all the magical creatures, wizards, goblins, centaurs, house elves, and hags living together in harmony. However, in most cases, they were denied fundamental rights that wizards had, the most important of which was the right to hold a wand. Goblins can perform magic without a wand, but wand magic is more precise and accurate in many disciplines than goblin magic is. There are only a couple other mentions of goblins in the text. One of them is in the book Goblet of Fire, where we see Ludovic Bagman, who is betting on Quidditch. He tries to he has a bet with the goblins that Victor Crumb's team, the Bulgarians, will win the Quidditch World Cup in 1994. It turns out that Crumb does catch the snitch, but at a point when his team is 160 points behind. which means that the Bulgarian team loses by 10 points. Forced to pay up, Bagman pays with counterfeit gold, leprechaun gold, which would and leprechaun gold disappears within a couple days. The goblin creditors pursue him, angry that they have been denied their rightful payment. And the goblin that we see the most of as a person is Griphook. Griphook first shows up in the Sorcerer's Stone. In the UK, publishes the Philosopher's Stone, when he guides Harry to his vault 682 at Gringotts Bank, and he further guides Hagrid to vault 713, which is the vault which has the Sorcerer's Stone in it. We don't see him again until the 7th book, where he is captured by Death Eaters and imprisoned in Malfoy Manor. He's then rescued by Harry Potter and his entourage, and escapes with them to Bill Weasley's house, where he decides to go with them and break into Gringotts to steal the cup of Helga Hufflepuff in exchange for Godric Gryffindor's sword, not believing that Harry and company will give him the sword, which we know, because the text is from Harry's perspective, that he was not planning to do. He steals the sword and traps Harry in the Gringotts vault. Harry manages to make his way out. Using Hermione's cleverness, she decides to free the dragon, and they use the dragon to escape, which was something that Griphook had not counted on. Griphook is seen negatively for the fact that he was not trusting of Harry. However, given the animosity and tensions between the wizarding and goblin communities, and of course, as we know from Harry's perspective, that he didn't intend to treat Griphook at all fairly, it's not surprising that Griphook took this antagonistic side. That said, there are lines like, when they were doing the planning, the idea that harm may come to lesser creatures did not upset Griphook, and he seems rather callous to the feelings and concerns of others. Since we don't have any other goblin encounters at the level of non-superficiality that we have with Griphook, it's difficult to tell whether his personal attributes are indicative of goblinkind at large, or are more indicative of his own persona. But a number of these attributes seem somewhat Jewish. The hoarding of gold, the sort of divisiveness between goblins and wizards, the stress on persecution and discrimination, and ultimately the sort of negative aspect of cleverness, that each was seeking to betray the other, that the goblins were untrustworthy, similarly to how Jews have been in anti-Semitic fashion deemed as untrustworthy. Never mind, of course, the physical similarities. You can see the anti-Semitic cartoon on the left and Griphook on the right. You have the large nose, the balding hair, the sort of plaintive expression. Goblins are referred to by dark wizards as having long fingers and sort of a menacing approach. You can see the goblin that first meets Harry in the Sorcerer's Stone on the lower right-hand side, that looks very similar to an anti-Semitic caricature. Rowling has said numerous times that the goblins, at least in her view, do not represent the Jews. She points to the fact that goblins are much more violent than the Jewish population ever was, with their numerous revolts. She points out that goblins are not human, and there are Jews in her work, although the Jews that are in her work all have the last name Goldstein, and and all of these characters are Jewish by reference, but not Jewish in action, meaning that they don't seem to celebrate Jewish holidays, they don't seem to have Jewish values, or act in, quote, Jewish ways, as, you know, we might understand that in a sort of more modern context. And in contrast to Lord of the Rings, J.K. Rowling's universe actually coincides with our own, right? The magical world is part of 20th century world history. It just happens to be a part of the world that we're not privy to, but it's part of our world, and so the Jews there should have some aspect of Jewishness to them. However, to that point, almost all of the characters who are not of traditional British stock, such as the Paddle twins, who are of Indian extraction, don't seem to embrace any traditions from their homelands in the books. In the movies, the Paddle twins during the Yule Ball do dress in more traditional Indian formal attire, but we don't really hear much about it in books. So that's the stuff on JKR. Any questions? Comments?
Very interesting, Richard. Very, very well explained. I mean, I haven't read any of this, and I'm keeping up with all these names, but things, but really, really wonderful. Thank you.
It was very good. And this is interesting, and it is definitely like just right out of the German newspaper, or or Egyptian newspaper. You know how they love us there.
Yeah.
Richard, can you say what are the most kind of always anti-Semitic caricatures that happen? I mean, that they are always there. I mean, what are the ones that they are? Everybody has that,
Sure. There are, if I were to draw for you the anti-Semitic Jew, the first thing to notice is the large nose, right? You can see it in the picture. The nose is obscenely large. There are jokes about this, of course, right? Like, why do Jews have large noses? Because the air is free. And so you have this sort of sense that, right, that Jews are noticeable for their large noses. You also have short in stature. That's another common stereotype, that it's not that they're dwarves by any stretch of the imagination, but they're shorter than Scandinavians. Brown hair, often balding. They're probably wearing some sort of Western business attire, but it's broken down or tearing at the seams. There's this sort of there's a one, and then when you get to the personality attributes, we're talking about greed. Greed is probably the most common one. Hiddenness and cunning. That the Jew will lie in a very beautiful way to obscure his negative intentions and thoughts. Another sort of corollary to that is that Jews seek evil or despondency among non-Jews, that they're trying to worsen non-Jews' situations.
Richard, and for example, in the relationship with the Jewish with non-Jewish people, what is the caricature of the anti-Semitic caricature about how Jews treat non-Jewish people?
Well, I mean, that cunning is certainly a huge part of it, right? That if we look at Shylock, which I think is actually less anti-Semitic than a lot of people give it credit for, but it's certainly anti-Semitic by a modern lens. In that Shylock gives a loan to this man that he's unable to pay back, and Shylock demands, which as is written in the contract, his pound of flesh that he's entitled to as recompense, right? So the Jew found this secret way of torturing this poor Venetian soul, right? This sort of underhandedness, this sort of cunning, that's the definition of the anti-Semitic idea of the Jewish-Christian relationship, that the Jews are this sort of parasitic entity that only survive because they use underhanded means to affect the Christian population.
Carissa has
there are many examples, and it goes back to goes way back to history, maybe not ancient history, but early European history. I know I was reading an article in a magazine called AEON about witches. And the witches were often connected to witchcraft, to Jews, or to people who were newly wealthy. And the word that was used was the witches' Sabbath. And I think this historical context, of course, made its way into literature all the way on up to one of the books by Roald Dahl, who spoke out about his disdain for Jews, is actually the book The Witches. And in it are all these anti-Semitic stereotypes in The Witches. You have it also in C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Yeah, no, that's correct.
Question, Rich.
Exactly. Let me just respond to that. The important thing to notice is that in a lot of medieval Europe, the idea of acquisition of wealth was itself magical, right? If you were a farmer and you made produce of your own hands, the correlation between your production and your wealth sort of made sense to people. The Jewish wealth, which derived primarily from banking, lawyering, and doctoring, all of which they were forced to do by edicts, by the way, because they were limited from the artisanal and but the fact that they made their money this way and that they became wealthy, people couldn't understand where that wealth was coming from, right? They didn't understand what the banking system did to generate wealth, what somebody was actually being paid for as a lawyer, what services a doctor was rendering, like was easier to defend. But in this case, you have this rapid generation of wealth, and so it seems almost like magic itself, right? That the Jews have tapped into some sort of satanic, demonic source of evil and managed to acquire this wealth through that means. And so and so a lot of that is how Jews became connected historically to witchcraft and to dark dealings of magic, in sort of this anti-Semitic lens, because of this magical wealth generation. Zach, you were going
And
to
the
say?
fact,
Oh, sorry.
and I think also, well, I think the fact that like you said, by edict, they were not allowed to own land and do the work that the majority of people were doing. They weren't allowed into the guilds, and so there was very little left for them to do, and it just happened to be in fields that required education. And of course, you couldn't see where the money was coming from.
Well,
Right.
Teresa has been trying to ask a question. Teresa, go ahead. Sorry. Thank you, Beverly.
Oh, I'm sorry for interrupting, though.
No. It was good in Carissa.
Actually, hi. I just love what you said, Beverly, too. I think I was just reading today or yesterday something about how some of the women accused of witchcraft had too much water in their well. Like that was one of the reasons they were accused of witchcraft. But not to when it comes to like stereotypes. I don't know if any of you are familiar with like Star Trek or like TNG, but like the Ferengi. If any of you are familiar with the Ferengi, it like even when you were, it wasn't this slide, but a different slide. It seemed like there was features that were, there were similar features, and a lot of the things you've highlighted about.
Oh no, the Ferengi in particular have been sort of noted as the one time that Star Trek embraced anti-Semitic stereotypes to a lesser degree. The thing with the Ferengi is that they're mostly harmless. They're just annoying. So they have the sort of the Jewish stereotypical Jewish attribute of being busybody salespeople, of being very greed oriented, very money oriented, and of course the flip side of that is that they have really no appreciation for sort of the Picardian understanding of the great design and the value of all things, right? So that's sort of the play of the Ferengi, that they're this aspect of the anti-Semitic stereotype, and of course they have the large ears and I think they have the large nose. I don't remember.
But even the longer fingers, I feel like when I think of Ferengi,
Oh yeah,
not that I think of them a lot, but that they're like doing this and they're like frequently hunched over and just like in pursuit of, and with the cunningness, not that they're very cunning, but trying to be in an attempt to like bamboozle
right.
people. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. That there's some of these aspects are in the Ferengi. I did not cover the Ferengi because I don't know the Star Trek universe as well as I know these two universes. But that they definitely would have been a third that you could include in this sort of canon.
Richard, yeah.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much. It's very entertaining. And secondly, you probably know the story about, speaking about Jewish caricature. There was a story probably 10 years ago when there were, in Danish newspaper, there were caricatures on Muhammad.
Yeah, the Yellen's
And then I believe Ahmadinejad was the president in Iran at that time. And they announced a competition of anti-Semitic caricature in Iranian newspaper. What Israel did in response, they said that's fine, and they announced a competition of anti-Semitic caricature in Idiot Ahronot.
Okay. I wasn't aware of the Idiot Ahronot copy of it. I guess I would have expected that story to end with glowing caricature and like positive caricatures of ancient Persians to sort of show where Ahmadinejad fell.
I believe this was the best response when you're not afraid of being laughed at. That's
exactly.
But it's funny with Iran, right? I mean, they have 30,000 Jews living there, or maybe less, I'm not sure. But and it's funny that Ahmadinejad, and even prior to him, there is a particular Orthodox Jewish sect called Magma something. Magma Karta, I forget the name of them, but
you're talking about Neturei Karta.
Yeah, Neturei Karta, yeah, I'm sorry. I call them Magma Karta, sorry. Neturei Karta, which was invited to Iran, you know, and they accepted the invitation saying that, you know, they're not Zionistic, and they went to Iran to kind of embrace them, you know, saying that the Jews are Zionistic, and here we're friends of Jews, but not those kind of Jews, you know.
Right. No, the Neturei Karta has done a lot of outreach to Arab and Iranian leadership because they believe, and we sort of touched upon this in the Zionist presentation, right? That there was a shift. The Zionist presentation, you can actually find it online if you are interested. That there was a shift in the early Zionist period from this sort of belief that the Messiah had to come in order to allow Jews to return to Israel. That there was the shift from this sort of view that the Messiah had to come to bring the Jews back into Israel to a view that the Jews were able to do it of their own power and spirit, right? This is the shift that Herzl leads and creates the modern Zionist movement. Neturei Karta is the descendant of a number of Orthodox movements like Agudat Yisrael that at first resisted this shift, that believed that and Zionism was a secular institution almost exclusively until the 1930s, when religious Jews started buying in. The Neturei Karta is the remnant of the religious Jews who are still anti-Zionist, whereas the majority of religious Jews accept Israel's legitimacy, even if they disagree with the specific policies of that country, as regards religion and the military and other things like that. But Neturei Karta believes that the creation of Israel is itself a blasphemy, and therefore is responsible for the doom of the Jewish people. So they oppose the existence of the state of Israel as rigidly as many of Israel's enemies in the Middle East do. And so they've reached out to them on numerous occasions to point out their opposition to Zionism as Jews, and then they're used as convenient foils by the leadership in those areas. I think what was particularly heinous about what Neturei Karta did by showing up in Iran in 2006 is that they attended the Holocaust Revisionism Conference. Now, admittedly, they made clear especially David Katz, who is the leader of Neturei Karta, who was invited and went. He is the descendant of Holocaust survivors, and he made very clear that the Holocaust did actually occur. Of course, nobody else at the conference gave a shit what he said. Excuse my language. Nobody cared what he said. But since he was there, it granted a sort of legitimacy to many of these Holocaust deniers for a Jew to be in their audience while they were discussing Holocaust denial. And so I think that if I disagree with his anti-Zionist opinions, but if he wanted to talk to Ahmadinejad about the relationship between Zionism and the horror in the world that he believes exists, he should have done it not at a Holocaust denial conference. That's probably not the right place to have that kind of conversation.
Yes, and interestingly enough, also in Iran, and I was talking to people that, the Jews that came from Iran, they said they kind of let Jews do their own thing. So let's say the Jewish kid going to yeshiva or the religious school in Tehran, for argument's sake, they let them, as long as they pray their religion, they don't touch them. But once they sway away or whatever else, then it becomes an issue. So otherwise, there's one Jewish, I think, person in parliament represent. Yeah, but it's all a farce, because whenever they
go ahead.
And whenever they see a person say something they don't like, they declare him to be a Jewish spy or Israeli spy. So it's difficult.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, sir. The thing is that Judaism is legal, Zionism is illegal. The problem is that Zionism is not clearly defined in law, in Iranian law. So, so they charge with Zionism anything that they don't like coming out of the Jewish community. There are laws on the books in Iran, last I checked, that every Jewish school must be run by a Shiite principal in order to make sure that the teachings are exclusive of Zionism or anything that could be interpreted as Zionism. Things that could count, for example, are at the end of a Passover Seder, Jews will say next year in Jerusalem, L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, which is this idea that the Jews should return to Israel in the full measure of their freedom as Jews in a messianic age. But this could be interpreted as supporting Zionism, that Jews should return to Jerusalem. So I think that sort of teaching those kinds of things, despite them being religious and existing long before the Zionist movement had any headway, these are classified as Zionist things by the Iranian government. And so it's very unclear where this border between Judaism and Zionism is. And it seems to be sort of, as you put it a little bit more blithely, whatever the Iranian government doesn't seem to like coming out of their mouths.
Correct. In particularly, is an interesting fact is when this parliament leader who is Jewish keeps saying he's anti-Zionistic and anti-Israel, which looks like, to me, we're so proud that we finally had a country after so many, thousands of years have no country. Like I came from Uzbekistan, and we're Bukharian Jews, which is one of the sects that lived there. And, for so many years, obviously I was leaving when Israel was created, but so many years when there was no Israel, there was a clear delineation when people used to say, especially in Zoroastrian, Uzbekistan used to be Zoroastrian, Turkestan region. They used to say, well, Jews, you guys got no homeland. You guys are kind of like, wandering, we're gypsies, basically. They were calling us in that kind of regard. And especially in Soviet Union, them first, accepting Israel and then, using it as kind of like we're abusers of Arabic world and stuff like that. And so, but when the country was created, it gave a lot of the Jews hope, especially a lot of Jews moved from Soviet Union to Israel in the 1970s, and stuff like that. That was a big deal to have a country, And we're going to talk about something like that, the stateless states, the ethnicities without a state, like Kurds, Kurds and stuff like that, and how it is important.
I'm going to do that presentation in 3 Sundays, so that's 28th of March.
Yes.
yeah, stateless ethnicities. And no, I agree with you. There's a saying that in the era of the nation state, the Jews were cosmopolitan, and in the era of cosmopolitanism, the Jews now have a nation state. So we seem to get the ire regardless of whether we do or whether we don't. My personal view is that it's an immeasurably great thing that we have a state as Jews. Because it gives us incredible negotiating leverage and it grants us security. Jews have fled from over 50 different countries to come to Israel under pain of persecution or death. So it's definitely something that is necessary, including many Jews from the Soviet Union, especially Bukhara. All right. Any final questions, or we're going to close it out for the night?
I don't know, Emilio, James, Sergio, any questions? CM, who is CM? I didn't recognize that name. How are you?
Hi, how are you?
Hi, this is a new person, or what's your name?
It's Claire. I'm just coming. So I was in and out, but I just found it really fascinating. Thank you so much for having this. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You registered for our wine presentation. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, looks so cool.
Yeah, and then any new person or whoever didn't register for our wine presentation is going to be the history of wine, and we're going to have our own Mark. He's going to have he's a certified Bordeaux wine specialist, so he's going to talk about the wine history and maybe even taste wine and tell us how to do it. I mean, I'm not an expert, so to me it's, and on Sunday we have an interesting one. We have actually a rise and fall of Vatsecas. So please do, next week we have a bunch of interesting, so go on the website I sent, omnicarta.org. We have all of our recordings there. This recording is going to be there as well. I'm sure it's going to hit, going to have a lot of hits. Well, we have some of the recordings hit about 300, 400 views, which is, for a new group like this, is pretty interesting, pretty good. And it's kind of niche, a group where, anybody's interested in history or stuff like this could discuss. I mean, we talk about anything here, but mostly our main wave is history. But, we talk about, history, anti-Semitism, electric cars, Bitcoin, anything like that.
You can, Zach, you can say from anti-Semitism to electric cars.
I also want to thank everybody for the kind messages I've been seeing in the chat. I really appreciate everybody coming out and taking what now basically 2.5 hours of your evening to read about old books that were published about 100 years ago. So, yeah.
It was incredible.
Yeah, great job. I know I never actually watched all the movies,
8.5 hours.
but I'm gonna watch them now. I'm gonna watch them. Like I gotta start from the beginning, like from
This is the thing I think is interesting. I would advise highly that you watch the extended versions of the Lord of the Rings movies. So that's a total of 11 hours, but it is totally worth it.
Wow.
But for the Hobbit trilogy, I would recommend that you watch one of the fan edits that cuts it down from the 3 movies into 1 4-hour movie, because the longer movie, while it is exciting, you sort of lose the plot a little bit, and if you do the shorter movie, you sort of see the track of Bilbo leading these dwarves forward.
Is are the movies faithful to the text of the books? I'm in the unusual position that I read all the books when I was a kid, and I've never seen one of the movies.
I would say that the Lord of the Rings movies are as faithful to the books as it is possible to do in the film genre. I think that's fair to say. There are some clear things that are different between the books and the movies. I think the most obvious one is that book 1 of the Fellowship jumps 5 chapters. They move from Bree to Weathertop very quickly. They don't see Tom Bombadil. They don't have the fight with the Barrow-wights. They don't have any of these sort of things of like, oh, there's a lake. Let's spend an entire chapter walking up to the lake. Because I think if a moviegoer were to watch that, they would just die of boredom. Another thing that's missing is the scouring of the Shire at the end of Return of the King. That is completely cut out because within the narrative, it's like you've just had the climax, and now you're in the middle of the falling action, and you want to have another conflict. Like it does, like from a film perspective, it doesn't work. People were already complaining with Return of the King that it has too many endings. So if they'd left Scouring of the Shire in there, then it wouldn't have made sense. But if you give it that sort of freedom to be a little bit different from the books, in that it can carry the weight of the story better, I would say that the extended versions of The Lord of the Rings are relatively faithful. And I think for many people, myself included, I find them better than the books are, unless you want to go lore diving. As a narrative story, as a human story, I think the movies are better. The Hobbit is not faithful to the books in that it carries the story of the books and it runs the parallel story of what Gandalf was doing at the same time. Right? If you remember from the Hobbit books, Gandalf at the entrance of Mirkwood basically says goodbye to Thorin and company. Lets Bilbo sort of guide them through Mirkwood, and he does his own thing, and then he shows up later with the men and elves at the doors of Erebor when they're debating what to do because Thorin won't give up his treasure. Right. The movie sort of follows what Gandalf was doing at the same time, and because of that, it creates this sort of much more climactic pre-Sauron engagement thing, which Gandalf was doing at the time. The appendices of Lord of the Rings confirm that. But because that story is on a different scale and scope than Bilbo's story, it seems to drown out the Bilbo story, and that's what a lot of people don't like about the Hobbit movie. They also don't like the fact that Legolas gets an entire subplot, which makes no sense. Legolas existed, but of course he isn't even mentioned in the Hobbit by name. Neither is his father. His father's just mentioned as the Elven King. So the fact that they have this whole expanded Legolas plot seems to sort of come out of nowhere. So that's definitely not representative of the text. But
Hey, I just thought of something right now. Sorry to cut you off. Do you think Spock and Yoda are the same guy? You know, Spock from Star Trek and Yoda from Star Wars.
I'll address that. But if you watch one of the fan edits of The Hobbit, they tend to sort of cut out the Gandalf plotline and they cut out the Legolas plotline. So if you watch a fan edit of The Hobbit, I feel like that is much more in line with what the books were doing. As to Spock and Yoda, I think that there is a functional difference between the two of them because Spock is all logic and no emotion, and Yoda is all emotion, no logic.
Oh yeah, well then explain those ears, buddy.
You mean how Yoda is Jewish? George Lucas has admitted in interviews that in designing Yoda's skull and his shape, he actually used Albert Einstein as a reference. He wanted Yoda to look smart, so he chose the smartest person he knew and just basically drew that. George Lucas is not the most inventive person. It's actually quite funny. Like the name of that sand planet, Tatooine, is literally the name of the place in Tunisia where he filmed. We actually went over this when we talked about Tunisian history, right? It's called Tatooine. So he calls the place Tatooine because he can't pronounce Tatooine. But other than that, a lot of the things and the cloaks that the Jedi wear that Ben Kenobi wears were inspired by the jalaba of the Tunisians that he was seeing all around Tatooine. So a lot of the stuff is sort of him just grafting what he sees in reality onto these other creatures. Or another example that really bothered me is if you go to Episode 2 of Star Wars, like the prequel ones, there are these insect creatures called Geonosians, and they have this sort of like click language, which sounds really interesting until you realize it's just English through a synthesizer. He didn't in this age of where everybody's inventing their own languages, if you didn't want the Geonosians to speak English, at least invent something, or pay somebody a pittance to write something. But no, he just put English in a synthesizer.
Cool. All right.
Rich, I appreciate that, and looking forward to your future presentation. Whenever other cool stuff like this, if you have that you want to present,
That was cool.
do and we can put it for a vote, or we don't have to, because people are gonna flock in and they love this stuff. And
No, the reason I put this up to a vote is because anti-Semitism is a touchy topic. You could see my interactions with Paul. I think he added a lot of great points, but there are some people who tend to be a little bit more touchy around those kinds of subjects, and that's why I wanted to put it to a vote. But if there's something else, I'll think about it, and you know me, I'll reach out.
yeah, if you want to discuss a movie, I don't care. I mean, some stuff that, look, to me, the Minister of Propaganda of Germany, that is, we haven't brought him up on the subject yet, Mr.
Goebbels?
But, just it's, fascinating how that human being was able to prove, not prove, but was able to
Convince people.
Convince
people that, that you could use a measuring, circles to measure the skull of a human, to determine, the clarity of the blood. I don't know. It's so stupid that I can't even.
No, but the thing is that actually that was
It's not his invention.
yeah, that existed long before him. That was a development of the late 19th century. Oh, what's the name of it? It's escaping me at the moment. It starts with a PH. But it's this idea that the shape of the skull, phrenology.
Phrenology, yeah.
Yeah. That the shape of the skull and the width of the nose and all these different things could tell you about a person's personality. Of course, we've disproved that quite conclusively. But no, the Nazis believed in this racialist science.
Yeah. And also another thing is an interesting topic to me is the Nazis believe in mysticism, right? They were looking for, they were going to Himalayan mountains to figure out if there was an Aryan nation that lived. Like, it's so stupid that, but apparently there was the squad, Nazi squad that.
Sure. No, the Nazis had their own mythology about the origins of the Aryan race, right? The entire idea is that the Aryan race is superior. They had civilization before anybody else, despite the fact that anybody who knows anything about the history of the world knows that civilization came to Germany actually rather late in the scheme of things, right? Germany didn't have major cities until about 1,000 years ago. Despite the fact that the Middle East had cities over 5,000 years ago, right? 7,000 years ago in the case of Sumer. So Germany clearly wasn't the start of civilization, but the archaeologists sort of had to square the circle here and find all these Aryan influences everywhere that proved that these Scandinavian Norsemen who founded Germany were these advanced civilizing pioneers, because that was the mythology. And Heinrich Himmler was actually quite famous for spending a lot of time trying to develop this kind of archaeological science. He really tried to square the circle, and he believed it. I believe that he genuinely believed his own propaganda.
That's a very human thing. You always have to justify, what you are doing. So you always have to find, a mythology, a history that will justify what you're doing actually.
Absolutely, but it's one thing to justify yourself through an embellishment, let's say, of the actual history, and it's another to try and pretend that the history was something totally different than reality and have to justify that delusion to yourself, right? Right, when the Spanish conquered Latin America, they had this delusion this belief that they were, God's chosen, that they had managed to pacify the natives because God was on their side and they were loyal to the cross and all these kinds of things. And that is not why they actually won, right? But it's close enough that the embellishment works. Until you have,
the most important thing, which example of Nazi Germany teaches us, that you can subvert the entire nation. Highly educated, highly civilized nation, one person, one party can subvert in just small number of years,
right,
and create whatever was
that turns on underlying social issues, right? Because none of these big upheavals happen, like, I don't know, you can take elections as well, simply because, oh, a simplistic reason, like these people are X, these people are Y, they're degenerates, which incidentally coincides with the other side being intelligent or whatever you want to call it. Usually it's death by 1,000 cuts. So it's a lot of little things that have added up over time, which may or may not have legitimate grievances, if you will, that then eventually explode because there is no outlet. And it's what's interesting, like now, is that you're seeing in real time in this country that same thing happen.
Absolutely.
Right.
That's
It's
very troubling.
hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, the QAnon phenomenon.
Yeah.
And that's the parallels I wanted to draw. And, I want somebody to step up, maybe to present something like this. Let's use Nazi Germany as a, perfect example.
I mean, I don't even think you need to use Nazi Germany as an example. Just do something, just somebody presents on QAnon. I think if you follow the rabbit trail, what QAnon is, and it looks very similar to cultish behavior, as well as this sort of Nazi German behavior. The two are inextricably linked. This idea of mass delusion based on false promises and false history.
Mhm.
Right. I mean, that's what's happening to Russia, and it's weird. I talk to my friends from Russia who are highly intelligent, and I don't recognize this brainwashing. Like, they think the United States is this evil, and I can't even. They have this, anchors on Russian TV who also they're Jewish, and they talk nonsense, anti-Israeli, anti-American bullshit. Like, it's funny.
It's Alexander Dugin. He's with
So,
his
this piece of shit, really. He's horrible. I mean, this guy he has like a big program on Russian TV, and he brings Zhirinovsky every day. And it's
You
just,
talk about Solovyov?
yeah, Solovyov. Yeah, he's
Yeah.
a complete, I'm sorry to say, Putin dig diver, so to speak. He's a horrible human being. And he spreads this propaganda. Now I talk to all my friends, I don't recognize them. They even tell me to the point there's like, don't even come here. You're not going to be comfortable in our Russia right now. Yeah.
Oh,
I don't know how you come up with your group topics. This is my first time here, but that would be definitely something something I'd be interested in attending. But also coming from like a factual basis too, because it's so easy to be influenced by emotion. I mean, obviously, and through the lens of personal experiences, but also just learning how to verify sources and fact check and sort through, I don't know much about this stuff. I'd like to learn more, but then also, how do you know what's a verifiable source and whatnot? And I have sounds like probably the least amount of education in the whole room, and I would love to know how to research these things, but to follow the right trails.
No, I guess there's two questions.
The way to do it is to read the literature from both sides. Now, depending on what side you fall on, the other side obviously might make you uncomfortable, but at the same time, you'll see, okay, so there is an underlying logic to this. Perhaps, they're developing these points of view, well, one, based on their experiences, but two, also based on their location, based on any number of factors. So if you're in that situation, okay, I can sort of see where they're coming from. And then you have your own sets of views, your own writers, authors, etc., and then something in between. And that it's more time consuming, and you have to definitely learn how to sift through something that's trash and something that's good, but that takes time. But generally, that's a good way to approach it.
Right. We did the presentation on Navalny. I don't know if you know, Navalny was poisoned by Putin henchmen.
Yeah, he's the Russian opposition figure.
Novichok, yeah, he's an opposition figure, very prominent opposition figure. And it was actually, in researching it, all I did is I just was pointing out that Putin built a huge palace in Krasnodar area, which is close to Crimea. And this guy is exposing $1 billion of wasteful money that they're spending, but at the same time they're showing how the schema works in Russian politics. How they trying to cover up this crazy spending by Putin. He's the richest man in the world. I mean, he spends billions of dollars on his own. That presentation is actually recorded as well. You can check it. And there's a video that I go through, showing his palace and stuff like that. It's so interesting. But those are things, that worry us, and let's discuss things like that. We don't repeat, German example, Russian example, and Trump example, let's just say. I mean, it's just, we have to have our own sanity.
Well, the danger to that is not that Trump gets elected. It's someone like Trump but with brains. That's what was it? Not Caligula. I don't remember. Catiline, right? In Rome, right. And then he was followed by Caesar, and then of course Augustus. But if you study those, it's silly. Every one of you knows this. There were underlying issues, right? Because the general population had democracy, but it really turned into, do you want to be exploited by rich guy A or rich guy B, and you don't have a job? So what do you want? And then Caesar comes along and says, I bring riches, etc. You can join the army, and you'll have wealth, etc. Or you'll have something. So all of these things build up, and I think it's interesting to see how 2,000 years later, we're at a similar crossroads.
Now that I have you on, Emilio, do you confirm you're going to do some in June regarding the Romulus, Ramus? I just wanted to make
Romulus and Remus, yep.
Okay, good.
I just want to address Carissa's question, because there were sort of two questions there. The first one is, how do we choose our topics? So we have a Saturday presentation, which is Ancient Civilizations. And I believe we're sort of in ancient Greece at this point, or ancient Rome. And there are Sunday afternoon presentations that happen sometimes. I think it's bi-weekly. And those presentations are really centered around World War II and sort of the modern period. But throughout the week, we, people just sort of talk to Zach about things that they are interested in presenting. I have sort of a track record in this group of making lots of pretty pictures, so they seem to like me. And so, I just sort of propose things that I think are interesting. And yeah, so that's sort of how we decide things in our group. As to your second question about how do you find out what information is true and accurate, that's really hard. So I would agree with Emilio that you should read sources from different sides of the political spectrum to see what the underlying story is. That's one approach. Another approach is to find specific individuals whose content you trust, because you trust their verification mechanisms, and they make very clear to you how they do it. I mean, I in particular like the show Rising, which is a YouTube show. I like how Ball and Jetty, which are the two hosts, I like how they move through information and how they comment on it. Also, look at look at what the newspaper mechanisms are for printing and creating a story. There are a lot of newspapers that will, like if you've ever been the subject of a newspaper article, you know how much of the story they get wrong. So it's very easy for you to see what's going on. Like I've been in New York Times articles. Obviously, I'm not the star of the New York Times article, but I have been in the New York Times before. And both times that they wrote articles where I was somehow involved, I felt like they completely misunderstood the story. So I have a lot of hesitancy where it comes to the large scale journalistic enterprises, simply because I feel like they're a story in search of quotes as opposed to using quotes to assemble a story.
Yeah, but what's the alternative? The alternative is
No, but it means that when you're looking at these stories, like don't take them at face value. Look at at the various other different kinds of media, and see if you can assemble from all of them what the actual narrative is. And it's time consuming and it's costly.
Well, and I think too, you were talking about like quotes and things being sensationalized. I think maybe, for lack of a better word, are you talking about like sensationalism and making a story conform to a headline that will sell?
There's definitely elements of sensationalism. I was referring more to how if you ask somebody information and you have a long form interview. By the way, I prefer long form interviews. I think that they're much more informative than newspaper stories on most long term topics. But if you have a quote, because a newspaper is going to bottle you down to probably about 2 or 3 quotes at most on a story, they're going to usually choose the quotes that conform to the vision of the story that they already have, not the vision of the story that you're trying to tell them. So that's the part that I wanted to point out, right? So if, for example, if the newspaper was doing a story about this presentation, they might say things like, they might have me quoted as saying, dwarves have humanity. And it's like, that's something I said. I don't think it's entirely representative of the point I was making. But they might be going from the angle of like, dwarves are humans, and you're like, oh, Richard said dwarves have humanity, so that's our quote. So it's just be careful of the way the newspapers are representing the people that are in their stories. Or TV shows also, like reality TV is known for this. If you watch, what's it called, the Tiger one, Carol Baskin is portrayed as being the same as Joe Exotic, despite the fact that she's trying to run a facility that helps tigers that can't be released into the wild because it's not safe for them to be released into the wild, and Joe Exotic is exploiting animals. So yeah, just be careful of the way these things are cut and put together. That's the key insight into how to read newspaper articles, and like, don't read it as if it is something that you're witnessing in real time.
There was a really nice bouncing off that Calvin and Hobbes cartoon strip where Calvin says, "Now I'm looking for a page 1 lead story. Can I interview you?" And his mom, who's cooking dinner, says, "Sure." Says, "Okay, what are you cutting up there for dinner?" "Fish." And his headline is, "Knife-wielding mother hacks ichthyoid. Grim melee is evening ritual. Suburban family devours victim." And that's what you get.
Yeah, there's another aspect to that. The editors of the people who write the stories don't usually write the title of the story, and they get it wrong. So yeah, the editor, it's not written by the same guy.
I guess too, with the introduction of online media, is that I guess I don't even really know what I'm saying at this point. I'm just throwing out thoughts. Please bear with me, but like that some of the people that I've spoken with, especially over the most recent political debates we've had, is that instead of, you're talking about like the New York Times, Richard, and people are considering like the New York Times or just even a local publishing, like a local newspaper, and someone's blog, like personal blog or YouTube page, as the same thing, like having the same credentials, assuming that everyone's doing the same fact checking. You mentioned, Richard, that you favor one particular channel over another because you've already done the research and you know how they look at the facts. You know that they have like what they say is like you can depend on that, or you can trust their sources. But some people just have, I mean, anyone can have a blog. I can have a blog, and
sure,
that'd be your first problem if you were reading my blog, because I don't know what I'm talking about. But like, these are all considered like the same sources. And then with, yeah.
No, let me drop a pessimistic view for Clarissa. I think there is no shortcut here. There's only way, as several people already mentioned, you have to read a lot. You have to create the whole incontroversial view of the world and particular subjects for you. And this comes only when you have information from different sources, when you compare them, when you realize, okay, this has certainly this accent, which cannot be true. This shifts in a different direction. So from several sources, you can kind of create your own version of the story. And there is no, in my view, I may be wrong, but in my view, there is no way around. It's it's a wide view, wide panorama of things. Only this can give you more or less true vision.
But regardless of what the conclusion I come to, it that doesn't change what the fact is.
Sure, but the issue, right? I think the Calvin and Hobbes story, I think, that puts it really well. There's nothing actually false about the Calvin and Hobbes sensationalist narrative of mother hacks ichthyoid to death,
right.
Because that's exactly what she did. An ichthyoid is just a fancy word for a fish. So there's nothing actually wrong about the story. The framing is the issue. So it's not a question about which facts are real per se. It's in that sort of story. There are questions about real and false facts in our news, but let's deal with one issue at a time. The first one is getting the framing right. So right, if you frame it as a woman kills ichthyoid, that has some sort of darker framing than the situation actually deserves or merits, right? That's what's wrong about the story. So the first thing is adjusting the framing, and the best way to do it, as Mikhail points out, is to calibrate your perspective based on your understanding of reality, right? To have a wide-ranging view of reality and then narrow down onto this proposition. Okay, is the anger and resentment here merited by the situation at hand, or is the tone merited by the situation at hand? Like, how is the author approaching this, and does that match how I understand reality? If the author, blithe, is, because I've read articles from, because my area of expertise is the Middle East, so I read articles from the perspective of very slanted sources, right? Because they're like, for example, Islamic State puts out their own materials, right? That's the terrorist organization that controlled the north of Iraq and Syria, and they write about what they did, and of course they talk about in very glowing terms, the fact that they're bringing new people into the fold and all these kinds of things. You have to realize what kind of context they're coming at it from, and there's information that they give that you wouldn't be able to find elsewhere. So you need those sources, but you need to understand the framing. The second part is, how do you determine what things are facts and what things are not facts, right? And that's why you use multiple different sources, because if the different sources can all triangulate on a certain set of facts that underlie the supposition, then you know that those facts are more likely true than not. Doesn't mean that they are true, but more likely true than not.
I can tell you a joke from Soviet past. Nikita Khrushchev and John Kennedy ran a competitive race. Kennedy is a young guy, he wins, and Khrushchev loses. And then a report on this in American newspaper and a Soviet newspaper. American newspaper says, yesterday there was a competition between our president John Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Kennedy won, Khrushchev lost. In Soviet newspaper, yesterday there was a competition between our great leader Nikita Khrushchev and American president John Kennedy. Our president was second from the leader, and Kennedy was second from the last.
Absolutely true.
Absolutely true. Yeah, but the sense is distorted. So no easy way around.
Thank you. I didn't mean to take over the conversation. It was a lovely presentation.
No,
I just came here to learn.
Which everything peters out and people are just sort of talking. I mean, I think everybody sort of said their piece about Lord of the Rings, you know, the Tolkien universe and the Harry Potter universe. Yeah, and I think, I mean, the reason that this interests me, well, right, like I'm a Jew, and so I see myself in these kinds of literature, and I also think that this is stuff that's not really talked about. Some people will sort of hint at it or mention it off to the side, but they won't actually, you know, delve deep and actually try and see how strong the connection goes. So that's why I presented it. But you know, we're just friends. We're just talking.
Next week, the Ferengi.
Yeah. Richard, thanks again. Was very interesting, very entertaining.
Yeah, it was. But I'm gonna zoom out now, and I'm gonna say thank you, everybody. It's good talking to you. And what do you call it? Oh, Zach, when's the wine thing? If you're still on tomorrow?
I'm
No?
still on. It's gonna be tomorrow. So Saturday at 12.
Oh, Saturday. Okay, cool. Saturday's cool. I'll see you guys Saturday. And then Sunday, I'm presenting the rise and fall of the Aztecs. If anybody's interested in that history, I'm gonna be presenting both sides of the situation.
Both sides.
Sorry.
Spanish public fake history.
Yeah. I meant.
The United States point of view.
You know, I only follow the Tlaxcala newspapers. I refuse to acknowledge that the Mexica and the Spanish, you know, have you know, I think that they're too biased in this fight. You know, only the Tlaxcala, I believe, you know, but you know, you have to take into account that their citizens were routinely taken by Mexica and, you know, and slaughtered for human sacrifices. So
yeah, this is true. But don't worry, we're gonna talk about the Tlaxcalans, the Mexicas, the Cholulas, and the Spanish. So you know, we'll have a good debate. You know,
Sergio, how do I get onto that? You said on Sunday it's the rise and the fall of the Aztecs.
Yes.
You haven't opened the
meetup group.
How did you get on this? The same way you got on this one, you could get on. It's on the link of the meetup page.
The same.
No, the meetup's not letting us sign up for it yet.
Okay.
Because
okay.
I mean, yes, so but I think Zach or somebody has to open it.
No. It's open for sign up. You can go into history most ancient, and then
right there, yeah.
And the wine history is at 12:30 on Saturday. Just click on it, sign up.
I found you guys through Meetup, so
yeah.
Meetup. It's through Meetup.
Yeah, you can see it there. I have your information, Chris. I'll send you a link to the exact page.
Yeah, I mean, I can put you in if you want, Clarissa. Unless, you don't have the meetup, right?
Is it on the calendar?
It is on the calendar. You can actually see it in the meetup group.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Clarissa. Okay, I'm gonna put her in. All right, no problem. All right, my friends, I'm gonna let everybody go. Have a nice evening, and I see you Saturday and Sunday, guys.
Yes. Have a good night, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Bye.